Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if your actions are truly your own, or just a reaction to something else? Well, this new study dives deep into how our brain predicts the effects of our actions. And it turns out, it is quite different for spontaneous choices versus when we're told what to do. This paper is all about what happens in our brains before we act, specifically focusing on how we anticipate the consequences of our actions. Think about it. When you press a button on a remote, you expect a channel change. When you flip a light switch, you expect the room to illuminate. Our brains are constantly making these predictions. But the researchers here were super curious about whether these predictions are the same, whether an action is something you choose to do or something that is triggered by an external cue. They wanted to see if the brain's prediction-making process works differently for I choose to do this versus this happened, so I must do this. At its heart, this research is built on the idea that our brain is like a prediction machine. It is always trying to guess what is going to happen next. And a big part of that is predicting the effects of our own actions. This helps us control what we do. We know that when something is triggered by a stimulus, like a flashing light telling you to press a button, that is one kind of action. But when you decide to scratch your nose, that is a different, more voluntary kind of action. The scientists wanted to see if the prediction patterns in the brain were distinct for these two types of actions, especially in the parts of the brain that deal with sensory feedback related to those actions. So how did they figure this out? They used a high-tech tool called EEG, which uses little sensors placed on your scalp to measure brain activity. Imagine it like a sophisticated lie detector for your brain signals. They recorded brainwaves while people performed actions. They looked at two main scenarios: cued actions, which are stimulus-driven, meaning something external told them to act, and voluntary actions where they decided to act on their own. They were particularly interested in the moments right before the action happened, the time when these predictions should be most active. They analyzed the data in a few clever ways to get a really detailed picture of what was going on in terms of the brain's predictions. Now, for the exciting part, what did they find? For the stimulus-driven actions, the cued actions, the brain's predictions were like a steady hum. They were active and present throughout the entire time the person was getting ready to act. It was like the brain was constantly checking and updating its prediction of what was going to happen when the button was pressed. This prediction process started in the front and middle parts of the brain and then spread out to the sensory areas that would process the expected outcome, like the visual cortex for a flashing light or the auditory cortex for a sound. But here is where it gets really interesting. For the voluntary actions, the ones where people just decided to press a button, the prediction story was completely different. During the early stages of preparing to act, there were basically no clear predictive signals in the brain. It was like the brain was in a holding pattern, not actively predicting the outcome. The predictions only started to show up very close to the actual moment of pressing the button. The researchers found that in these voluntary actions, the parts of the brain that normally process sensory feedback didn't show clear, predictable patterns in the early stages. Instead, they seemed to enter a sort of standby state. This state was so subtle that regular brainwave analysis couldn't pick it up. However, when the researchers used more advanced techniques that looked at how different parts of the brain contributed to making predictions, they could detect something. It was like the brain was ready to be influenced by random neural noise, and it was only in this vulnerable state that it could be nudged towards an action. This finding about voluntary actions being noise-driven is super important. It suggests that when we don't have a strong, clear reason or goal for acting, when there is no clear why behind the action, our brain might rely on random neural fluctuations to initiate the movement. This is a significant limitation of many typical free will experiments. They often ask people to do something simple, like flick a switch for no reason. Without a goal or purpose, the action becomes pretty arbitrary, and the brain's preparation for it is much less structured. And this difference wasn't just confined to the moments before the action. The researchers also looked at what happened after the action, specifically when they unexpectedly omitted the expected sensory feedback. In the stimulus-driven actions, when the expected outcome didn't happen, the brain showed a strong prediction error signal, a clear sign that something unexpected occurred. But in the voluntary actions, this prediction error signal was much weaker or even non-existent. This makes sense because if the brain wasn't strongly predicting the outcome in the first place, the omission wouldn't be as surprising. So, to wrap up the main story, this study found a big difference in how our brains predict the effects of our actions, depending on whether the action is triggered by an external cue or chosen freely. For cued actions, predictions are active and evolve over time. For voluntary actions, especially when they lack a strong purpose, predictions are almost none. existent until the very last moment, and the initiation might be driven by random brain activity. This really underscores how important the why is for our actions. Simply asking people to choose freely, without any goals, might not be the best way to study the real mechanisms of volition. This really connects to a fundamental question in cognitive science. How much are our anticipated outcomes shaping our actions even before we begin to move? This research provides strong evidence that for externally triggered actions, these anticipations are indeed active and play a significant role throughout the preparation phase. The main takeaway here is that the brain's prediction machinery operates very differently for different types of actions. When an action is cued, the prediction process is well organized and starts early. But when an action is voluntary and arguably arbitrary, the brain seems to be in a less predictable, more noisy state until the very last second. The study highlights that some existing theories about how we predict action effects don't quite capture the full picture, especially when it comes to voluntary actions. The idea that predictions are actively involved in the early stages of voluntary action initiation, as some theories suggest, doesn't seem to hold up for actions that are arbitrary or lack a strong why. Now, looking critically at the study, the researchers themselves point out a limitation. While they designed their voluntary task to be better than older methods like Libet's clock, they acknowledge that the chosen actions were still pretty arbitrary. Participants weren't acting out of strong personal motivation or a clear goal. This is a real challenge in studying volition. As they mention, future research needs to explore this why dimension much more deeply. What happens when voluntary actions are driven by strong goals or rewards? How does that change these brain prediction patterns? So, what does this mean for us? It suggests that our sense of willing an action is deeply tied to how our brain prepares for the outcome of that action. When an action has a clear purpose and we expect a specific result, our brain gears up for it in a very organized way. But when an action is just a choice without a strong motivation, the process is far less structured and might rely on random neural activity. This has implications for understanding things like decision-making, habit formation, and even conditions where our sense of control is impaired. The biggest next step for researchers is to bring in that why factor. How do things like rewards, personal goals, or even a sense of responsibility change the way our brains prepare for voluntary actions? Understanding this could unlock a lot of doors in understanding human motivation and consciousness. And that's it for this dive into the fascinating world of action. Effect predictions. It's amazing how much our brain signals are telling us about our own choices, even before we consciously feel like we've made them. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts on voluntary actions, and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more mind-bending science. We'll see you in the next video.